Thank you so much for joining us. We truly appreciate that you took the time to attend this webinar. I am going to walk you through what happens next, and likely that would be in the fall, after teams have worked through the flashback, flash forward discussion. So what would be the next step? But before we do that, let's take a look. Next, Julie, please. Thank you. Let's take a look at what this, you can go back one more. Sorry about that, Julie. Thank you. Let's take a look at what this second grade and third grade team came up with during the flashback, flash forward process. So second grade made a decision that they were concerned they might not be able to fully, students would not be able to fully master the standards that the 2.3 describe how characters in a story respond to major events. They were concerned that they might not in the remote environment be able to truly get there. Third grade also said, we really know how important it is that students understand character traits when it comes to plot development. They need to understand that piece. So here, if I'm looking at this as a third grade teacher, I know that I really have to include standard 3.3 and ensure that students have a deep understanding of character traits as they go through it. Now you can go, Julie, thank you. So before diving into the process, I want to just emphasize a few important points about what you see on the screen. This may look like a familiar process you may have engaged in at some point. It looks similar to an unpacking or an unwrapping process. The intention here is for teams to, even if it's been done before, engage in this process prior to each unit of instruction so there's clarity about what the standards that you deemed essential actually mean. So I know in the past when we've engaged in unpacking or unwrapping, we've engaged in the process maybe months before a unit starts. So we're intending that teams before, maybe 3 to 5 days before instruction starts, for teams to dig into this process. Another important point is that the team should include all educators who work with students in that particular grade level or course. It's critical that special educators and others who work with students in that grade level participate in the process. So that's back to what Julie was referring to related to collaboration earlier. And as Heather mentioned, it's about the discussions that occur and the clarity that's gained through this process, not about compliantly filling out the boxes. So this is really just a protocol to guide a really good discussion. And the last point I want to make before we dig in and I show you what it's all about is that this is doable with all grade levels, all content areas. We're giving you and showing you an elementary example, but it's possible and beneficial for all grade levels, all courses to engage in this process. So let's review how a team might use this protocol. The first thing they would do is determine or identify the standard that they are going to actually really work through in a discussion. And so you'll notice up there on the screen at the top, the standard that we mentioned earlier in the flashback, flash forward is in the document at the top of the screen. Go ahead, Julie. And the next thing that the team would do is identify what are the verbs, what are we actually asking kids to do? So in this standard, there's two things. We're asking students to describe and we're asking students to explain. Next, Julie. The next piece is let's figure out what we're asking kids to know. And so in this particular case, we're asking them to know the traits and motivations and feelings of characters and be able to describe them. And we're asking them to know how characters' actions contribute to the sequence of events. So, and we need them to be able to explain how that happens. So I know the reality of the situation is if I put a standard in front of 5 people, I will have 5 potential different interpretations of that standard. So far you can see already we're getting a really good understanding of what is actually being asked here, what students should know and what they should be able to do. In the next piece, we're considering the DOK in the area in the box labeled level of thinking or type of assessment. We're considering the DOK level and the type of assessment that we might use if we're going to check in on these particular learning targets. Now that we've really broken up the standard, we know that there's 2 learning targets embedded in this standard. And so we take a look at DOK to really understand the level of thinking. For example, if the skill, like it is in the second box there, is to explain, then we want to ensure that in instruction and definitely in assessment, we are asking students to explain. We're not asking them to pick from a list, we're asking them to explain so that we're honoring the level of thinking. So this is how the discussion would go. And we think it's important that teams have that discussion and really talk that through. You'll also see the vocabulary listed there. And that's important because those are the things that we want to ensure that students deeply understand, the terms that students deeply understand before we expect them to describe and explain. So we really want to pull that vocabulary out and ensure that we pay close attention to it instructionally and potentially through assessment. The next piece that you see in the far right box there in red are the scaffolds. And what we're thinking there is what we want teams to be able to do here is to deeply look at what are we actually asking kids to do for that particular learning target. And if that's what we want them to do, then what do we need to think about before instruction begins to ensure success for all students? What might be difficult for them? How are we going to consider what's difficult? It means we need to have read the text we're going to ask kids to read, and we're going to identify what might be difficult with the grade level text. For example, let's take a look at what the 3rd grade team decided here. They decided that the text complexity might be difficult for some of the students. So they decided that they might start, and I say start because we would never stay with lower level text, but we're going to start with some lower level text to build confidence with the skill and to help students be able to describe the characters in maybe lower level text. Eventually moving to grade level text. So we're building knowledge, but intending to get to grade level text. So that's what you see in that scaffold there, in addition to using some manipulatives for students to actually match traits with characters. So potentially pictures of characters matched with actual traits on slips of paper. So things like that are just some initial, in this discussion, it's really more of an initial conversation about what might be difficult and how might we address some of the difficulties that we know could happen. You'll also see the learning progression listed there. And this is to show how the team might think about progressing through instruction. The arrow indicates that we would start with the least complex learning and move to the most complex learning in number 8, which is actually the full standard. You'll notice that number 4 and number 7 and number 8 are all highlighted. That's because number 4 is the first learning target, number 7 is the second. So this is set up for numbers 1, 2, and 3 to be the knowledge that students would need to have in order to be successful with the skill in number 4. Numbers 5 and 6 would be the knowledge that would lead to success in the learning target identified in number 7. Taken all together, numbers 1 through 7 would ensure success with being able to show mastery with that full standard. So that's how the learning progression works initially. We'll dig into the learning progression in a little more detail in a minute. But before I take you into that deeper look at the learning progression, here's a few ideas to consider regarding scaffolding. I will tell you that Our plan for the 2-Day Institute is to dig really deeply into this topic. But for now, here's 3 things to consider as you start to think about scaffolding. First, before I get into those, I want to make it really clear, and it says it in red right there, but our goal is to make grade level content accessible, not easier, by lowering the expectation. So this doesn't mean we're just going to make it easier. We're going to give them all kinds of things that will make it easier for them to be able to get through. This is really about making difficult content more accessible. So how do you do that? Examine what makes the task difficult. Spend time really, excuse me, understanding what makes the task or the text difficult for students. And then also think about the scaffolds that would make it easier for students to be able to access the text. Not easier in the task, but easier to access the text. What we want is productive struggle. We want students to productively struggle through a task versus doing it for them. I mean, I taught middle school language arts and social studies, and I will tell you, I was guilty at times of thinking I was helping students when really I was giving them a scaffold like, don't read the text, it's okay. I'm just gonna give you a PowerPoint of what the text says, right? And instead, I really kind of didn't give my students a chance to productively struggle through some of that text. I should have thought about scaffolds to help them be able to get through that text and in an easier way for them. And then the third piece is, if I'm going to ask students to be independent, what are some of the things that I need to think about in terms of how I'll support them while they tackle the work? But I'm not going to be the one who does the work for them. So finally, we'll get to this learning progression. And once the team has worked through the process that I just walked you through, and they've outlined the learning progression in a more general way in the doc that we just went through, they would then move into this more detailed learning progression that also considers assessment and stopping points for assessment, as well as grade level text, and then some ideas for scaffolding text. So if you look at numbers 1 and 2, the team has determined here that they will check in with student understanding of traits and details in a more unobtrusive and informal way through teacher observation, potentially in small groups or by just observing students working independently. Perhaps they would use a checklist and determine that, which would help them determine where are certain students struggling. Where might I even need to extend for some students who seem to have this down really well? But this is really how this learning progression will play out. You'll notice number 3, when they're looking at motivation, they're thinking also unobtrusively, more of a teacher conference. But when we get to number 4, which is the actual learning target or skill, this is where they have their first common formative assessment. This is where the team has said, we're gonna check in as a full grade level team to identify whether students can actually do this skill or not. And if not, we're gonna make a plan and figure out how to ensure that they can. You can go forward, Julie, thank you. So this slide is really here for your reference later to identify what I just talked through, how to consider the learning progression, the knowledge and skill piece, and how to use that maybe in a more unobtrusive way, teacher conference, checklists, all of those things that we talked about earlier, and then looking at how you would potentially take the skill items and be a little bit maybe more obtrusive, more traditional, paper, pencil. Still could assess that in a more unobtrusive way, but that's the conversation that could happen through the development of the learning progression. This slide just walks you through numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the learning progression, but it's very similar to what I just described in numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is here for your reference. Again, we will talk very specifically and in a lot more detail about what the development of learning progressions in the 2-Day Institute. So hopefully if that's something you're interested in, you can participate in that. This is just another look at the full process before you get to the learning progression, just so you can see how it all comes together. And I want to just take one moment to remind you that you are doing this with the most essential standards, as Heather indicated earlier. We're not going to do this with everything, because while this process, as Heather said, she was able to get through it, the flashback, flash forward part of it in about 40 minutes. While this process goes faster the more you participate in it, we still only have time to do this around the things that we've identified as most essential. And then lastly, I just want to comment on how if we do engage in this process and have a deep understanding of what the standards mean that we'll be working with kids, and I mean everybody who works with grade level students, then there will be more consistent opportunities for students to work on grade appropriate assignments aligned to the essential standards, aligned to the things we said were important for kids to know and be able to do. It will also provide an opportunity for students to engage in instruction that's strong and thoughtful and truly aligned to what we know is important for them to know. And hopefully it will give the teachers an opportunity to really develop lessons that provide deep engagement for students, that it's about them doing the work and not the teachers as much doing it for them. And then that last piece is when we're crystal clear about what the expectation is, then we can hold students to those high expectations. And we know, and the research supports, that when we hold high expectations for kids, they rise to the occasion. So that's something that we want to definitely consider, and a main reason why we engage in this process. I want you to think for just a minute, take some time to reflect on, maybe you're currently planning a process that will ensure consistent interpretation of the essentials. If not, what are some ways that you can ensure consistent interpretation of the essentials? So we're just going to